Welcome to the interview here on France 24. I'm Philip Crowther in Washington, D.C. Our guest today on the interview is a former National Security Advisor to U.S. President Jimmy Carter and a trustee here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the U.S. Capitol. Zbigniew Brzezinski is our guest on the France 24 interview today. Dr. Brzezinski, thank you very much for being with us.
It's nice to be with you.
I've got your latest book here with me called Strategic Vision, America and the Crisis of Global Power. I'm sure we'll touch upon it throughout the interview, but let me first go towards maybe the most pressing issue, being Syria. Can I ask you, how do you realistically see a way out of the crisis in Syria?
Realistically, it's not easy to see a way out, but realistically, there has to be a way out. And the only way out, I think, is determined patience, trying to create some sort of an international coalition that is truly international and is prepared to put sustained pressure on the government of Syria, but doesn't try to take over the government of Syria and doesn't attempt a military intervention.
It's a coalition that for the moment does not exist. Should the United States meanwhile be working on this potential military intervention just in case, and is it?
Well, what does it mean, potential military intervention? Potential by the United States or potential by other powers with U.S. support? And if so, who? And how effective is it likely to be? It's awfully easy to agitate in the newspapers about the need for an intervention. But what are good examples of it? We did intervene in Afghanistan because we had to. We've been there for 10 years. We intervened in Iraq, which we shouldn't have had to the second time. And look at Iraq today, how stable is it? We did intervene in Libya with Britain and France in the forefront, but that was easy. This isn't.
Is another option the arming of rebels in Syria, as was the case in Libya, for example? Is that something that could lead to a conclusion of this crisis in Syria?
The Libyan crisis wasn't resolved by us or others arming the rebels. It was resolved by military action and overwhelming military power and a lot of things happening quietly, not known to the world. In the case of Syria, we're dealing with a country which so far as I can tell, maybe I'm missing something, the army has not cracked. The army seems to be united. The secret services seem to be united. There is a fair amount of violence in the country on a sporadic, dispersed basis. There's no territory being held by the rebels. And as far as I know, there is an organization called the Free Syrian Army, but it doesn't seem to be very much in evidence. So we have to face these realities. I think the only solution for this, which doesn't plunge the region into a comprehensive region-wide conflict, which links Syria with Iraq, with Iran, is in effect some sort of united, comprehensive pressure by the major powers, like the G5 plus one that are negotiating with Iran, plus maybe India. I think that is the kind of an international coalition that has to be fashioned if it is to be effective.
Well, one country that's clearly not a part of a coalition for the moment is Russia. A lot of criticism coming from the United States recently, from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as well, that Russia is helping the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Is that an opinion that you share?
If it's a judgment of fact, I would say, yes, it is right, they're helping it. But I'm not sure that they're helping it in order to help it against us. That is to say, they have a different view of the problem. Without them participating in some fashion, without the Chinese and the Indians going along with it, we just don't have the kind of international pressure to effect a significant change. And I think we have to recognize that fact. But simply starting another war in this region requires asking what are the likely consequences of that war, not only in terms of Syria itself, but in terms of the negotiations with Iran, in terms of the possibility of the conflict embracing Iraq. These are serious issues. And who's going to be stuck with resolving these issues? The people who start the war.
On that matter, let me read a quote to you that from a recent interview with a US broadcaster. You said that the situation in Syria is, quote, not as horrible or as dramatic as it is portrayed. Would you still stand by that?
Well, of course. I mean, look at Rwanda. Look at Sri Lanka. Look even next door. The estimates are that about 20,000 people have been killed in Mexico, including some slaughtered near the American border with heads and limbs cut off. Is anyone seriously recommending that we intervene militarily in Mexico?
So when could it potentially come to an end, this crisis in Syria?
Well, it could come to an end in two different ways. Either Assad and his regime prevail, which will be very unpleasant for a lot of people, and from a democratic point of view, very, very unfortunate, or it plunges into a civil war, which then at least gives the parties concerned, including us or others, the opportunity to side with someone. But simply sporadic right fighting, occasional outbursts of extremely brutal violence, is not in itself the basis for making serious policy decisions.
Now, Iran is also one of the big supporters, I suppose is the right word, of the Assad regime as we speak. Would you say that Iran currently is the worry number one for the Obama administration in terms of foreign policy?
Well, it should be, because I think the choices that we face are very, very serious and potentially as damaging as the ones that we have been discussing. Namely, if the negotiations with Iran break down, in part perhaps because of the Syrian problem. And then we are facing the prospect of some military collision with Iran, perhaps with the Israelis initiating it, but with the Iranians retaliating against us. That is a very serious risk as well. And it does create the potential of a lot of problems in the region, erupting together and at the same time, and also with far-reaching and negative consequences for the world economy.
What would that scenario then concretely look like? You say an Israeli attack on Iran, a possible reply from Iran towards the United States. At what time could this happen, and what kind of concrete detail could one expect if that scenario was?
Well, I'm not a prophet, so I can't really pick precisely the time. But I should think, given the parties involved, that in one way or another, some will be calculating that a good time to start something of this sort would be shortly before the U.S. elections.
As in very soon?
Very soon, but also fairly precisely when.
Now, here in the United States, there's a lot of talk by the Obama administration of the end of two wars, the Iraq War officially having come to an end, and there being an end date for combat operations in Afghanistan. The one word we don't hear is victory in Afghanistan. What's your assessment of this very long war in Afghanistan? Was it a victory, or was it even a failure, possibly?
I supported the decision to go into Afghanistan. We had no choice. We were attacked from Afghanistan, and the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban government, was giving shelter to those who attacked us. 3,000 Americans were killed. But I remember that at the end of the consultations, to which I was marginally invited, I wasn't a decision maker, but I was invited, I did say to the Secretary of Defense that while I fully endorse the decision to go in and wipe out the Taliban and seek to destroy Al-Qaeda, we should not set for ourselves very ambitious long-term goals, but try to withdraw as soon as possible, give them economic aid, but not get involved in a prolonged nation-building exercise, which has now lasted 10 years, and which makes us participants in a prolonged, destructive civil war. I think we have to draw a lesson from that.
Would you agree that with the administration, if you will, that a nation is indeed being built in Afghanistan?
No, I don't think it's being built. I think it's being dismantled. I think that the internal differences in Afghanistan are becoming more acute. The fact that large portions of Afghan population considered to be Afghan citizens are now also being able to identify themselves with adjoining states that are independent. The Tajiks in Afghanistan are important. They don't get along with the Pashtuns, but they also now realize there is a Tajikistan. That is bound to have an effect on them, on the Uzbeks, the Turkmen, who are in Afghanistan, but who all of a sudden realize they're countries of their own next door. We're just seeing the beginning of this process. And this is incidentally why the Russians should be worried too. because it means that in the long run, Central Asia could become unstable because of the dynamics set in motion in Afghanistan.
There are all sorts of foreign policy puzzles on the U.S. president's plate right now. How would you assess Barack Obama's foreign policy moves in his time in office so far?
I think his moves have been intelligent and, so to speak, contextually in keeping with the unfolding history of the 21st century, the basic lesson of which is that this is not a century in which one country can be a hegemon for the world, which was really what the 20th century was all about in terms of 2 world wars and the Cold War. He understands that. Whether he acted decisively enough on some issues early on, one can debate. But one first, before making any final decision about a judgment regarding his performance, has to look at the alternatives offered by the opposition here in America. And so far, they have not been reassuring in terms of their realism, in terms of their understanding of contemporary world.
Well, let's put a name on the opposition. Mitt Romney will be the Republican presidential candidate in November. What about his foreign policy expertise? Do you think he can possibly do better than Barack Obama has so far?
Look, I'm not going to be so demagogic as to say it's out of the question. President Truman was an unknown quality when he became president. He was one of the really impressive American presidents. The capacity of a person emerges when challenged. Romney has not been challenged. So far, however, he has not articulated an intelligent vision of the world in which the United States can play a constructive role along the lines of the book by me that you mentioned, namely a role which is derived from a reasonable geostrategic understanding of the nature of the century. He hasn't demonstrated that. Obama has pointed in that direction, but he hasn't quite delivered.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your insights, Dr. Brzezinski. It was a pleasure. You've been watching the interview on France 24 with our guest, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski. Please do stay tuned to France 24, plenty more news coming up.